Hello and welcome to week 2 of Philosophy and the Good Life video overview. I'm Dr. Chris Fleming from the University of Western Sydney's School of Humanities and Communication Arts. So what I'm going to do this week is, again, just give you a brief overview of what we did in the seminar. And it's really in two parts. One is to do with David Brooks's thesis in The Road to Character, and the second in the second part of this we're going to look at the theories of normative ethics. So in the first part of the seminar, what we did was we looked at David Brooks's idea in the excerpt from his book, The Road to Character, whether or not there has been a shift, a general shift in culture, say over the last 50 years, away from an ethic of humility or self-effacement, an idea of the common good, towards a kind of selfishness or self-aggrandizement, at least, a kind of narcissism. A kind of self-importance in people, that people have lost a degree of humility. And the various views expressed about that. Obviously, this is not a view you have to accept, or a view that you have to accept unqualified, but it's really there to open up a question about character, what it means to have a good character and so on, which I'm going to return to later on, and we will return to later on in the course. So that was really the first part of the seminar. We then moved on to a discussion and a presentation of the three basic approaches to normative ethics. So if you look at something, if you define justice, say, in terms of giving people what they deserve, just say we start with that conception of justice, then the problem then becomes, what do people deserve and why? So when faced with an ethical decision, the first approach I'll talk about is the utilitarian approach. So the utilitarian approach to that question will be, well, whatever serves the general good, whatever produces the most utility. Jeremy Bentham, the first philosopher who really articulated utilitarianism as a philosophy, determined this or framed this in terms of pleasure and pain. He called these our two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. And he said that all decisions of this nature should come out in favour of producing the most pleasure. Later this was articulated as producing the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. It's an intuitively plausible position. So what is the best course of action? That which causes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So one of the main objections to that kind of approach to these to ethical questions is that it doesn't provide any criterion for the nature of the choice that you make. So, for instance, it might be feasible that people gang up and pick on someone because they experience a lot of pleasure out of this, and the person who undoubtedly suffers, they're only one person, and the pleasure produced outweighs the suffering. And so people have drawn this criticism, given this criticism of utilitarianism, which utilitarians have responded to in various ways, but nonetheless, this is just an overview. Okay, the second approach was the deontological approach, which is mostly associated with the work of Immanuel Kant, or at least first framed in that way, although we did talk about John Rawls as well in the original position later on in the seminar. But here is what you have basically, this idea of a rights-based approach, that you have certain absolutely categorical duties to other humans, to human dignity. So the question of where a utilitarian might say, well, we'll torture someone if that produces the right results, that is, it produces the right consequences. The deontologist, the rights-based theorist, may say, no, you don't ever do that. It doesn't matter what the results of this torture are, that is simply not something that can be done to a person. So this is the second approach to normative ethics. And so the idea here is that there are fundamental or categorical duties that are universalizable, that apply to everyone everywhere, that there's no self-exceptions. There's no exceptions. Okay, so that was the second approach. Now, one of the problems with the deontological approach is that it can't make sense of a lot of what we might think of as movements towards justice in the world today. One example I gave was, for instance, the idea of an apology to the stolen generations in Australia, or the kind of reparations that young Germans are trying to make on behalf of their grandparents. Now, the obvious question is that if Kant is right and we are responsible for our actions, and each of these, our decisions comes down to this individual basis, and that each individual is a kind of has inherent dignity, and each individual exercises their will and so on, then what does it mean to make reparations for a past which doesn't assume that justice can be caught in this single moment? I mean, there are other questions being asked of the deontological view, is that what rights are we going to decide on, right? And how do they apply? The third approach that we looked at was virtue ethics, which is the oldest school or branch of ethics, normative ethics, which goes back to ancient Greece, and particularly to the work of Aristotle, who we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks. It's a more difficult position to present, but roughly stated, the virtue ethicist will say that in terms of an answer to the question of justice, what does a person deserve? Well, they deserve something in line with their virtue with respect to a conception of the good life. What on earth does that mean? Well, what the virtue ethicist wants to talk about, in a way, is the nature of the character, the kind of person that the judgment is being made about, for instance. So, and people often feel quite awkward about virtue ethics because it seems like an imposition of morality, and seems kind of old-fashioned, to talk about courage or honesty as these kind of basic virtues. Therefore, most of the public discussions around normative ethics in the public domain are debates between a utilitarian view and a rights-based view. And the terrorist example, the ticking time bomb example, is really an example of that. However, one of the points that I tried to make was that very often in our discussions of these ethical issues, there is a virtue approach which is sneaking in. So, for instance, one of the things the scenario I gave is, imagine there's a terrorist with a ticking time bomb. The utilitarian says, he needs to be tortured in case we can, avert disaster and save a number of people. And then I raise the question is, well, if he's not talking, can we then torture his 10-year-old daughter? Now, one of the things that may give a utilitarian pause there is not because he or she is not committed to the greatest happiness for the greatest number, is that we're implicitly making judgments about the terrorist and the kind of person he is. Maybe he deserves a bit of rough treatment because he's not a good person, right? So in that sense, virtue ethics often sneaks in to other kinds of discussions. And so one of the things that virtue ethics tries to do and tries to talk about is that this development of human capacities. The Greek term for virtue, arete, basically could also be translated as ability. So virtue ethicists see these abilities as necessary for the proper functioning of human beings. So it's just like your hands or your thumb is necessary for the proper functioning of your physical body. They hold that these virtues are necessary for the full development or flourishing of a human life. Now that might seem very abstract and kind of strange at the moment defined like that. But what we're going to try to do is draw out a couple of these points over the next few weeks. And so hopefully I do realise that the presentation of all this material is a lot to take in at one, in one big gulp. But hopefully what we'll be able to do over the next few weeks is clarify some of these issues where they need to be clarified, and continue on. And so please bring questions to class, and including questions like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and we can hopefully deal with that. So next week we're going to be looking at some of the Socratic dialogues. So Socrates is a philosopher from ancient Greece, and we're going to have a look at some excerpts of his thinking and incidents from his life. So until then, take care. Signing off.